Why are human beings relatively poor at making attributions? This question really reminds me of another statement that I heard in communication that said that as humans, we do a pretty good job of communicating messages, but we do a poor job of communicating meanings. And what this particular quote signified was we often know what we're trying to say, and it sounds good in our own mind, but when we communicate that message to someone else, things get lost in translation. And we often have to say, well, that's not what I meant, or what I meant to say. And what that simply means is sometimes there's miscommunication, there's misinterpretation. Same thing with this. We see things, we see certain people, we see certain behaviors, but because we don't know all of their frame of reference, we don't know all of their history, we don't know their whole life story, we don't know their background, we tend to misattribute or to misjudge or to misinterpret a lot of those actions that we're seeing. All right? Once again, someone talked about transparency. It's important. And sometimes when we're not transparent in acknowledging how our own cultural identity is going to impact how we see someone else, then we're more apt to have misattributions. Several of you talked about the fact that we don't take time to gather enough information. So the story is often incomplete. We jump to conclusions. We see certain things and then we go based off our own history, our own understanding. We filter this new thing that we're seeing through our old lens. Well, here's what this means to me. Last time I saw this, it meant this. And we just simply say that every time we see certain actions, we already have an explanation for that action. And oftentimes we jump to conclusions and we don't take in consideration so many factors that we may not be privy to. Some say there's a lack of understanding, unwillingness to think outside the box. So sometimes it's not just ignorance within the standpoint of not knowing, but I often tell my friends when I speak about racial reconciliation, ignorance isn't simply not knowing. Sometimes ignorance is not knowing when you should have known, when you should have known better. And so sometimes we must be honest with ourselves in admitting that we don't take the time. We don't take advantage of taking the time to investigate, to learn other people's stories, to do our homework, to research history, and things of that nature. And when we fail to do so, then when we make misattributions, it's not simply because we didn't know. It's because we didn't know when we should have known, or at least when we could have known if we had taken time to know. We talked about egocentric bias. So now we are all about self. It's all about our culture. And when we see other cultures, we interpret what they're doing based upon what we do. And this is something that happens all the time. We always filter what others do through the way we would do it. And we fail to take in consideration the fact that people are different. And different doesn't necessarily mean bad. But sometimes when it's all about us and we're always into ourselves, not only do we acknowledge difference, but different becomes wrong. And the way we do it becomes right. And of course, we've already established that that is not a correct way of thinking. Someone said we don't extend enough grace. And what I gathered they were saying is sometimes we are just too judgmental and we jump to conclusions too quickly and not extend enough grace to figure out, okay, what is another possible reason for this action? We always assume the negative reasons for someone's actions. We never take in consideration or give them the benefit of doubt that what they were doing were for admirable reasons. Or we just take things out of context. And once again, I think having relationships will allow us to better understand someone's story and help prevent us from those misattributions. Someone says it's virtually impossible to be objective. So we make a lot of assumptions. This is very true. We try to say that we're objective and we're just looking at the facts, but rarely are we just looking at the facts. We normally look at those facts, but we have a way of distorting the facts based upon our own frame of reference. And this oftentimes leads to double standards. When we do something wrong, here's a logical explanation of why this happened. When someone else does that same thing wrong, they're bad people. So it's almost like, it reminds me of a photograph I saw in a magazine a while back, and was actually featured in one of our, actually this particular book, if I'm not mistaken, when during Hurricane Katrina. There was a young man in the water with some groceries, and it said, the young man looted groceries. There was a similar picture of a white couple in the water with groceries, and it was, this couple found food. Same type of scenario, but the caption was totally different, and it made assumptions. One looted, one simply found food. And that goes to the fact that sometimes when we operate with an egocentrism, when we operate in a way that we misattribute, it's often going to lead to us having double standards. And finally, we just talked about how stereotypes and things of that nature are just so ingrained in our culture that oftentimes we don't even realize that we're attributing things based upon these stereotypes. And so I think it's important that we be mindful that when we look at people, especially people who are different from us, that we don't begin to see different as being wrong, but just different is different. And we begin to appreciate the richness in those differences. And I think this is going to help us minimize any misattributions. All right? Thank you once again. This has been Professor Theo.